March 14, 1945. Woodhall Spa, Lincolnshire. Dawn has barely broken over the airfield, and already the ground crews are sweating, even in the cold. Beneath the belly of a specially modified Avro Lancaster, a single object hangs where normal aircraft would carry an entire bomb bay's worth of ordnance. It is longer than a family car, painted matte black, and shaped less like a bomb than a giant dart. Ground crew have had to remove the bomb doors entirely and modify the fuselage just to let it hang there, half exposed to the sky. It weighs nearly 10 tons. 10 men could stand in the crater it is about to make and never see over the rim. The aircraft's crew, from 617 Squadron, the men who 2 years earlier had breached the Ruhr dams, walk out towards their machine. They know this weapon by its codename, though few of them yet grasp exactly what it is designed to do. They call it Grand Slam. Their target lies across the North Sea, the Bielefeld Viaduct, a vital rail crossing carrying supplies to what remains of the German war machine. It has already survived months of conventional bombing. Ordinary bombs have hit it, cratered the ground around it, even snapped a support or two. The Germans have simply repaired it again and again. Grand Slam is not designed to hit it. Grand Slam is designed to make the ground beneath it disappear. Just after 9 that morning, Squadron leader Jack Calder's Lancaster releases the bomb from roughly 4,270 meters. It falls for the better part of a minute, reaching a speed close to the sound barrier, spinning gently on its own axis to keep its nose true. It does not explode on impact. It is not meant to. It buries itself deep into the earth beside the viaduct's foundations, boring through soil and rock like a needle through cloth, and only then does its explosive core detonate. What happens next has no real precedent in the history of warfare. The ground itself convulses. A cavity the size of a small building opens beneath the viaduct's piers, and 120 meters of masonry arches simply fold downward into the earth as though the ground had swallowed them whole. There is no need to hit the target directly. The target's own foundations have ceased to exist. Watching from a following aircraft, the crew of a photo reconnaissance Lancaster circle back to capture the aftermath. Through the camera lens, what should be a stone viaduct standing proud against the gray German sky has become a wound in the landscape, a long, ragged trench where a railway crossing used to be. There is no fire, no great pall of black smoke rolling upward the way conventional bombing raids so often produce. Just silence, dust, and a gap where certainty used to stand. This is why Grand Slam matters. It represents the moment British engineering solved a problem that had haunted Bomber Command for years. How do you destroy something that conventional explosives simply cannot touch? To understand why such a bomb was ever necessary, you have to go back to the uncomfortable truths Bomber Command faced by 1943. The RAF had spent years refining the science of area bombing, dropping thousands of tons of ordnance on German cities and industrial centers. It worked, in the sense that it caused devastating damage and disrupted production. But against a certain category of target, it barely worked at all. Reinforced concrete U-boat pens, some with roofs over 5 meters thick, shrugged off direct hits from standard bombs as though they were pebbles. Railway viaducts, built from solid masonry with deep foundations, could be cratered and patched within days by slave labor gangs the Germans were entirely willing to work to death. The Möhne and Eder dams, famously breached in 1943 by Barnes-Wallace's bouncing bombs, had demonstrated that certain structures needed an entirely different approach. Yet even that success relied on a highly specialized single-use weapon that could not simply be scaled up to attack everything else. The numbers told their own story. A standard 4,000-pound cookie blast bomb carried perhaps 3,000 pounds of high explosive and detonated on contact, dispersing most of its energy uselessly into the open air. Even the heaviest bombs in general RAF service by 1943, the 8,000-pound and later 12,000-pound types, still exploded at or near the surface. Against thick concrete, That meant chipping and cratering rather than genuine structural failure. Engineers calculated that to bring down a viaduct or crack a U-boat pen roof through brute surface force alone, you would need thousands of sorties, an impossible commitment of aircraft, crews, and fuel at a point in the war when all three were desperately finite resources. There was also the question of loss rates. Every additional raid against the same hardened target meant sending crews back over increasingly well-defended airspace again and again to achieve results that were, at best, temporary. Bomber Command's planners understood this arithmetic all too well. Aircrew losses across the strategic bombing campaign ran into the tens of thousands, and every wasted sortie against a target that would simply be repaired within the week represented lives spent for very little lasting gain. The pressure to find a genuinely decisive weapon, one capable of destroying a target permanently in a single strike rather than merely inconveniencing it, grew more urgent with every month that passed. Intelligence reports from occupied Europe only deepened the frustration. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed U-boat pens along the French and German coasts surviving raid after raid with barely a scratch on their working interiors, protected beneath roofs so thick that even direct hits from the RAF's largest conventional bombs left craters no deeper than a modest garden pond. Slave laborers, forced to work under brutal conditions, could patch cratered rail lines and rebuild damaged masonry with dispiriting speed, often restoring critical supply routes within 72 hours of an attack. Bomber Command was, in effect, fighting a war of attrition against concrete and forced labor, and losing. Barnes Wallace, the very same engineer behind the bouncing bomb, had already been arguing since before the war began that the answer lay not in more explosive at the surface, but in a wholly different kind of destruction, what he termed the earthquake effect. His theory, first outlined in a lengthy paper circulated in 1941, proposed that a sufficiently large bomb, dropped from a sufficiently great height and built to withstand the impact intact, could penetrate deep into the ground before detonating. The explosion, trapped and amplified by the surrounding earth and rock, would then travel outward as a genuine seismic shockwave, undermining foundations from below rather than attacking structures from above. No target, in theory, could be built strong enough to resist the ground itself giving way beneath it. The problem was that nobody, in 1941, could actually build such a bomb. It would need to be immensely heavy, aerodynamically stable enough to survive supersonic terminal velocity without tumbling, and constructed from steel strong enough not to shatter on impact with rock and concrete. No British aircraft existed that could lift such a weight in the first place. Wallace's idea sat largely ignored for 2 years, dismissed by many in the Air Ministry as an engineer's fantasy, until the failures of conventional bombing against Germany's hardest targets became impossible to overlook. The breakthrough came in stages. Wallace first scaled his theory down into what became Tallboy, a 12,000-pound deep-penetration bomb introduced in 1944, essentially a smaller proof of concept for the earthquake principle. Tallboy proved devastating in practice, used to sink the German battleship Tirpitz and to collapse sections of the Saumur railway tunnel in France. But Wallace had always intended Tallboy as a stepping stone. The true weapon, the one capable of genuinely unstoppable destruction, would need to be nearly double the weight. That weapon was designed at Vickers Armstrongs, the same firm behind the Wellington bomber and the original bouncing bomb, working closely with Wallace at their Weybridge design offices. Grand Slam, officially the bomb. Medium capacity, 22,000 pounds, weighed almost exactly 10 tons, roughly the mass of 2 double-decker buses. It measured just over 7.7 meters in length, a little longer than the wingspan of a small aircraft, with a distinctive tapered, streamlined casing designed to survive the immense stresses of impact intact rather than exploding on contact. The casing itself was the real innovation. Cast from a single piece of high-tensile steel, forged and machined by Sheffield Steelworks, including the English Steel Corporation, using techniques adapted from naval gun barrel production, the shell had to be strong enough to punch through several meters of earth or concrete without deforming, yet thin enough at the tail to house nearly 2,400 kilograms of Torpex explosive, a filling roughly 50% more powerful than standard TNT by weight. 4 offset tail fins, mounted at a slight angle, spun the bomb as it fell, using the same gyroscopic stabilization principle that keeps a rifle bullet flying true, ensuring it struck the ground nose first at close to the speed of sound rather than tumbling and losing its penetrating force. Producing a casing of this size and strength was, in itself, close to the limit of British heavy industry in 1944. Sheffield's forges had to develop entirely new casting and tempering processes to produce a shell that would neither shatter on impact nor crack under the pressure of its own detonation before it had burrowed deep enough into the ground. Fewer than 100 were completed before the war ended, and for years afterwards exact production figures remained closely guarded. Even now, historians work from incomplete wartime records, and different sources give slightly different totals for how many were manufactured versus how many were actually dropped in anger. The filling process demanded almost as much care as the casting. Torpex, developed originally for naval torpedoes, was more sensitive and more powerful than standard TNT, and pouring nearly 2.5 tons of it into a casing that size, without introducing air pockets or weak points that might cause premature detonation on impact, required specialist teams working to exacting tolerances rarely demanded of conventional bomb production. Every completed Grand Slam represented weeks of skilled labor across several separate facilities, from initial casting through machining, filling, and final assembly, at a time when Britain's industrial base was already stretched thin, supplying every other theater of the war. To put the scale of the finished weapon in everyday terms, imagine a bomb roughly the length of a double-decker bus laid on its side, but considerably heavier, since the 10-ton mass was concentrated almost entirely in dense steel and explosive, rather than the mostly empty interior of a bus. The sound of a Grand Slam detonation, recorded by witnesses on the ground, has been compared to nothing so much as a controlled, localized earthquake. A deep, rolling thud felt through the soles of the feet before it was ever heard through the air, quite unlike the sharper crack of a conventional high-explosive blast. Carrying it required its own modest miracle of engineering. No standard Lancaster bomb bay could accommodate Grand Slam. Vickers had to design a special version, the Lancaster BI Special, which had its bomb doors removed entirely, its mid-upper gun turret deleted, and its fuel load reduced, simply to lift the weapon into the sky at all. Even stripped down this way, the modified Lancasters were operating close to the absolute edge of their structural and aerodynamic limits every time they took off with a Grand Slam slung beneath them. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Operationally, Grand Slam saw action only in the war's final 10 weeks, yet in that brief window it proved devastating against precisely the targets conventional bombs had failed to touch. After the opening strike on the Bielefeld Viaduct on March 14, 1945, which collapsed several spans entirely, 617 Squadron went on to use the weapon against the Arnsberg and Arbergen viaducts, against U-boat pens at Varge near Bremen, and against the Valentin submarine assembly bunker, whose roof, at over 4.5 meters of reinforced concrete, had been considered effectively bomb-proof. A single Grand Slam strike there punched clean through the roof, something no earlier weapon had managed, halting construction of the facility for good. Records of the psychological impact on German personnel are comparatively sparse, since so few witnesses left detailed accounts before the war's end. But surviving reports from Luftwaffe and construction officials describe genuine disbelief that any bomb could penetrate defenses considered impregnable. Repair crews who had grown almost accustomed to patching conventional bomb damage within days found themselves facing collapsed foundations that simply could not be rebuilt with the labor and materials still available to a collapsing Reich. At the Valentin submarine bunker, construction workers, many of them forced laborers from occupied territories and concentration camps, had spent well over a year toiling under appalling conditions to complete a structure the Reich's engineers had promised would be entirely bomb-proof. When the Grand Slam struck on March 27, 1945, punching straight through the roof rather than merely scarring its surface, it did more than halt construction. It exposed, in the starkest possible terms, the gap between German confidence in fortified concrete and the reality of what British engineering had achieved. The facility was never completed, and no submarines were ever assembled there. 617 Squadron's aircrew themselves left more personal accounts of these operations, describing the strange, almost anticlimactic nature of dropping a weapon so large. There was none of the shuddering, rapid-fire release familiar from conventional bombing runs. A Lancaster carrying a single Grand Slam simply lurched upward, suddenly 10 tons lighter, as the great dark shape fell away beneath it and dwindled slowly towards the earth far below. Crews reported watching it fall for what felt like an unusually long time before the ground itself seemed to shrug, rather than explode, in the distance. Germany never fielded a true equivalent. The Luftwaffe's heaviest conventional bombs topped out at roughly 2,500 kilograms, less than a quarter of Grand Slam's weight, and German bomber aircraft, focused throughout the war on tactical rather than strategic roles, were never designed to lift anything close to that mass. The closest German parallel lay not in bombs at all, but in the enormous railway guns and the V-3 supergun project, static or semi-static weapons attempting to achieve destructive scale through entirely different and considerably less successful means. The Americans, meanwhile, pursued heavy bombing largely through sheer numbers and high-altitude precision daylight raids rather than single oversized weapons, and while the United States Army Air Forces did experiment with deep penetration bombs of their own late in the war, none matched Grand Slam's combination of size, penetrating power, and proven operational record. American heavy bombers of the period, principally the B-17 and B-24, lacked both the payload capacity and the specially modified bomb bays that would have been required to carry anything approaching Grand Slam's mass, and no equivalent weapon reached operational service before the war in Europe ended. It would take the Americans until decades later, with modern bunker-buster weapons developed for entirely different conflicts, to revisit Wallace's earthquake principle in earnest, and when they did, his original 1941 calculations proved to have been remarkably close to correct. Even within Britain, Grand Slam remained a strictly limited resource. Only a single squadron, 617, along with a handful of aircraft from 9 Squadron, were ever equipped and trained to deliver it, a reflection of just how few Lancasters could be modified for the task, and how few bombs the country's industry could actually produce in the time remaining before Germany's surrender. This scarcity meant that every target selected for a Grand Slam strike had to justify the enormous cost and effort involved, reserved almost exclusively for the handful of structures that conventional bombing had already proven it could not touch. The true legacy of Grand Slam lies less in the tonnage of masonry it collapsed than in the principle it proved. Barnes-Wallace had demonstrated that destruction did not have to mean brute force applied at the surface. It could mean precision applied at depth, using the earth itself as the delivery mechanism for the final, decisive blow. That idea, dismissed as impractical fantasy in 1941, reshaped how military engineers the world over would think about attacking hardened targets for the rest of the 20th century. Materially, historians remain divided on precisely how much Grand Slam altered the course of the war's final weeks, given how late it arrived and how few were ultimately dropped, somewhere in the region of 40 operational releases in total. What is far less disputed is the effect on morale, both British and German. For Bomber Command crews, Grand Slam was proof that no German structure, however formidable, was truly beyond reach. For those on the receiving end, it shattered the assumption that concrete and depth alone could guarantee safety. Surviving examples of the bomb itself are rare. An inert Grand Slam casing can today be seen at the RAF Museum in Hendon, another at the Imperial War Museum Duxford, and the collapsed sections of the Bielefeld Viaduct site still bear the scars of that March morning in 1945. a permanent record of what a single weapon, dropped just once, was capable of achieving. Return for a moment to that Lincolnshire airfield, to the ground crew straining to load a bomb longer than a car and heavier than a house onto an aircraft never originally built to carry it. Consider the maths involved: 10 tons of steel and torpex, falling for the better part of a minute, punching through solid ground at close to the speed of sound, before unleashing the equivalent of an earthquake against Foundation's engineers on both sides had once considered unbreakable. Grand Slam did not need to strike its target directly, because it never had to. It attacked the one thing every fortified structure on Earth shares in common: the ground it stands upon. Where conventional bombs chipped and cratered, Grand Slam simply removed the Earth from beneath its enemy's feet and let gravity finish the job. Barnes Wallace had spent 2 years being told his theory was unworkable. By the spring of 1945, the collapsed viaducts of Western Germany told a different story. 10 tons of British engineering had done what thousands of conventional bombs never could. It had proven that the deepest foundations, the thickest concrete, the most confident assumptions of safety, were only ever as solid as the ground beneath them, and that ground, it turned out, was never as safe as anyone believed.